shall resume.
Mr. Commissioner, we continue to analyze where we stand on timing, and I may just alert you to this in advance. After perhaps 2 or so council's questions this afternoon, I may canvass whether we might be in a position to proceed without an afternoon break to conclude by 4 o'clock as we must today. I'll just alert you to that, and we'll raise it in the course of the afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I have approximately half an hour left in terms of what I indicated I would take. To be quite blunt about it, Mr. Commissioner, I could take 2 days of cross-examination in this area, and we are all pressed to compress things into the realistic timetable that the government has provided to you. Firstly, I want to correct for the record that in the course of this morning's cross-examination, I was speaking to the stewardship program, and I was speaking to the number of stewardship programs that were initiated during the 1998 to 2003 period. And I said that 25, I was instructed that 25 of those programs existed. I have been corrected during the break. It's 25% of those that were stewardship programs that were initiated during that time exist today. So of what I'm told is approximately 50 programs that were initiated during that program, 25% of those 50 carry on. And I understand, Ms. Reid, that you undertook that you're going to try to provide information to the inquiry in this regard, correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. Secondly, just before the lunch break, we spoke of the prosecutions in British Columbia. And when we get to enforcement, I will put this document in. I have before me the annual report to Parliament of your department, and in this document it shows one conviction in the Pacific region for the year 2008-2009. You don't have that in front of you. Assuming for a moment that you have no reason to disbelieve that, my question is this: what effect on compliance, which is your area, is there when there is the cumulative effect of only one conviction in 2008-2009, and also when it is in the public record that your department is not doing much in the way of monitoring? What is the cumulative effect of that in terms of managing and seeking compliance of the public in respect to the Fisheries Act, and in particular sections 35 and 36? I'm happy to go either direction, from my right or my left.
You're in the middle.
Mr. LeBlanc.
I think when you look at these numbers, you have to remember there could be a number of other actions, enforcement actions that are taken but didn't end as a conviction in that fiscal year. So I'm not familiar with all the data that comes in. So there may be a lot more actions that have been taken, and it takes sometimes it takes many years before it gets to the courts and gets ironed out. When you're looking at, and I'll step back a bit, when you're looking at compliance, part of our policy is to use a continuum in terms of compliance, a balance between among education, advice and assistance, and compelling the proponents to take action in cases of non-compliance or non-conformity with the requirements of the Act. You do need a balance of all three. You need to have compelling ways of, or have ways of compelling people through enforcement actions. Yes, that is. There are many different forms of that. It could be an order, could be a direction from an inspector's direction, or it can be laying of a charge. So there are different enforcement ways to enforce the law other than just bringing people to court.
Thank you. Any reason for either of the other two panelists to speak to this? Seeing, yes, Mr.
I've just had the point that from an operational perspective, the number of convictions isn't really the substantive issue. The value of enforcement is around the deterrence factor. It's demonstrating where the bar is in terms of threshold of tolerable effect, and the government being in a position to take a regulatory action when those kinds of conditions warrant. So some years there may be a fair number of convictions, other years there may not be, and it's not necessarily the annual total that is reflective of the value of that part of the program.
But Mr. Wang, isn't there a message to the public when there is only one conviction in the Pacific region for a given year, and when evidence becomes known, as this is a matter of public record, that you really aren't doing a great deal in the field of monitoring? What is the message to the public when that information is received? Doesn't that invite violation of the Act?
Well, again, I would come back. I would agree with I think the underlying point that you're making, that enforcement is important to habitat protection. But again, the point to me is that it's not about the quantity of convictions. There may be a year where circumstances are such that either, as Patrice said, cases are in progress, so they haven't resulted in a conviction yet, or maybe a number of things are still in the course of proceeding through the respective measures. And there may be other years where we get a number of them all coming to term at the end of the day. It may be useful, if I'm understanding your point, to explore the relative type of issue that we're able to investigate operationally, and the number of those things and how we attend to them. But the story isn't singularly demonstrated by the number of convictions.
Well, I'm going to tender evidence to the other panel in terms of enforcement that, as I said previously, there have been 24 convictions under Section 35, 24 convictions under Section 36, for example, 1997, 1998. In other words, 25 times what we were dealing with in 2008, 2009. All I'm saying is, when word gets out of that situation, isn't that make it difficult for you in terms of seeking compliance of the public?
Well, again, I think what the issue that would be significant in terms of compliance would be that DFO is not going to pursue a regulatory action on this kind of issue anymore. So it's the threshold of tolerance that is the issue that I think sends the message to the public, rather than the quantity of convictions. So I think I understand the point, and I don't think I disagree with it, but it's not the sum total of numbers that is the question that's at hand. It's more about what is happening on the land base, what kind of capacity has DFO got to undertake its regulatory and enforcement action, and then how does that transmit a signal or a message publicly?
All right, and one of the foundations of your entire schematic is that there is a voluntary program where a proponent, as we understand, voluntarily submits for a referral. Is that correct? And you're shaking your head in the affirmative. The fact that it becomes known that there is no monitoring or follow-up on applications or referrals, doesn't that also invite non-compliance by parties, or invite parties to not even submit for referral?
I can say, using some examples, that we have seen that trend. I've spoken earlier in this part of the proceedings about Shuswap Lake as an example, and we have seen recently in things that I would describe as routine patrols, a reemergence of practices around foreshore development that had previously been done in a much more sustainable way, and they were starting to show up again on the landscape in a way that we had previously had under some degree of control.
Thank you for your candidacy to that. I want to come to budget. We've you have alluded to the shortfalls in funding to do the kind of programs necessary. Is it correct that over the last, and I'll direct this question to Ms. Reid, over the last 5 to 10 years, your budget for habitat regionally is been stabilized? It hasn't increased, but you haven't lost a great deal of money on the budget. Is that correct?
Well, I think you have to take the sunset money out of that when you ask that question. So the sunset money was a big bump. When that went away, the budget did go back to kind of previous levels, and it has essentially stabilized with some adjustments.
Yes, and when you say stabilized, the fact is over those same years, there has been an increase in salaries, has there not?
Yes, but salaries are, you do get an increase for salary increments. Within a stabilized budget, you would still get your salary increments, with the exception of right now when there's been a budget freeze for 3 years.
Yes. And in terms of that budget freeze, that is consequential, obviously, to budgeting for habitat in the region.
It impacts on budgeting?
Yes.
Yes.
And we have heard from your Deputy Minister, Ms. Dansereau, in testimony here last October, that as of this fiscal year, a few days ago, you're facing down a 5% cut nationally on the DFO budget. You understand that to be correct?
With regard to the budget freeze, is that what you're
Yes,
referring
I guess budget freeze, but if my memory's right, she didn't describe it as budget freeze. She spoke of a 5% reduction of budget for the upcoming fiscal year. Well, upcoming meaning now.
Yeah, so there's a couple of impacts on our budget this year. The first one is this 3-year budget freeze, which, because of salary increments, translates over that time to about 4.5%.
Yes.
And then in addition to that, the department went through a strategic review, which resulted in an approximately 5% reallocation of the department's funding.
Okay, and I have so little time here, but Dr. Riddell testified, obviously a former DFO employee, that a 5% reduction in overall budget really speaks to a 15 to 20% reduction in the operational side of budget, because you can't tamper with salary levels, and therefore, and I'm happy to show you the reference in the testimony, but I think most council will recall him saying that 15 to 20% reduction in operational expenses. Do you agree that 5% reduction or 4.5% reduction in overall budget hits very, very hard on the operational side?
In the case of strategic review, we're not focusing the cuts simply on operating money. We're focusing it overall, so there could be salary and operating impacts. So it's not concentrating per se. It's spread across the board. And I would say that there's two things. There's the 4.5%, which is the budget freeze over 3 years, and then there's the strat review element. So you got to kind of keep those two pieces separate when you're looking at impacts.
Okay,
I'm sorry, but I know it's not correct that we were going to focus all the impacts on what we call operating money. It's going to be spread across the board.
Spread across the board in the sense that you can tamper with PSA salary levels?
No, but you can impact on the number of what we call full-time equivalents, the number of people that you have.
Oh, so the way you might deal with it is to reduce staff to make good on the salary, on the operational reduction of 4.5 or 5%. Is that what you're saying?
So in the case of strategic review, it's an overall reallocation. You can look at operating and full-time equivalent salary dollars to come up with a package of how you're going to affect your 5% reduction.
Right.
The budget freeze, which is separate, so the budget's frozen. The increments, the salary increments continue to go up, and so you'll end up with a salary shortfall, which you can deal with either through reducing your number of FTEs, your full-time equivalents, or by reducing your operating dollars, your operating program.
Thank you. And Ms. Reid, let's get down to bare bones. The fact that there is this 5% or 4.5% reduction in budget is going to have a detrimental effect on habitat management in the region. Do you agree?
I agree that there'll be an impact on the budget. That is, there'll be less money, for sure, yes.
Yes. Auditor General has done reports in respect to habitat initiatives by your department, and you're familiar with them. And again, because I don't have the time, I simply want to refer to the PPR, paragraph 8. I think this is the fastest way of getting through this. And between paragraphs 8 and, I apologize, paragraph 47 to 54, and it deals not only with the Auditor General's reports, but the CESD reports. And had I had more time, I wanted to go into those recommendations and to the obligations that you as a department have committed to, and probably Mr. LeBlanc is the best to deal with this area. Mr. LeBlanc, because of the shortage of time, would you agree with me that where these two reports, or these number of reports, have been critical of habitat management, that the DFO did commit itself to meeting certain deadlines? Would you agree with me that you have not been meeting those deadlines up until now?
In terms of the response to the CESD report?
Yes.
We have provided an update to the Auditor General. The CESD, the Commissioner on Environment Sustainable Development, reports to the Auditor General, so it's the same office. We have provided an update that we're on track with most of the work that we were committed to do. Some is still ongoing. Work on the MOU on Section 36 with Environment Canada. We have put a quality assurance program in place. We've responded to most of the recommendations. Some is still ongoing, I should say, because some of them are for 2011, 2012, and beyond.
So are you saying that where in your responses to these reports you indicated that you would accomplish certain things by a deadline, that you have met those deadlines?
In most cases, we have.
Can you give examples of where you haven't and what one can expect in terms of when you will accomplish it?
I'd have to look at the map, and I don't have access to it right now because I don't know where it is.
Is it fair to ask of you, through Commission Council, to speed this up, that you simply provide to us in due course, to this Commission, where there are outstanding obligations where you have not met deadline and when you anticipate meeting deadline?
There is a report to go to the CESD in a relatively short period of time. I think has been submitted to the Deputy Minister for her approval.
Right.
And that will give you an update on all aspects of the CESD response.
And will we receive that report?
I believe that indeed is number 34 in our list of documents, which we circulated notice of some weeks ago.
Okay, but that was in draft form, Mr. Martland? I hear from the witness this is a document before the Deputy Minister at this moment?
No, I appreciate, in fact, that does bring to mind that the document we gave notice of was the map that was the earlier version. Number 34 on our list should be the one recently received.
So, Mr. LeBlanc, is that the document that you speak of?
Yes.
I would like to have it entered as an exhibit. I'm told by council it's already entered.
Marked as exhibit number 665.
Thank you very much. I move to the next area, which is wild salmon policy, and Ms. Reid in particular. We've talked about habitat status reports at this inquiry, and today in testimony you said, if I understand this, and I hope I'm in context, you said we're beginning to do that work, which is habitat assessment on a CU basis. These weren't your very words. And if I have understood your testimony correctly this morning, can you give examples within the Fraser watershed where you have completed any habitat status report?
Okay, I would ask, actually, if you don't mind asking Jason that question.
I have no problems, thank you.
I'm not sure I can help, actually. I don't, to my knowledge, I don't think we've done a full one as a habitat status report. And I'm reaching a bit here, but I believe there was some one that was done on one of the sockeye watersheds up in Stuart Takla, but it was a fairly early pilot, I'll call it, and I don't believe it was done to the full extent of the recommendations that came in the fairly recently published paper that provides for the habitat indicator context, I guess, with some recommendations. So I don't think we've done any, but in the interior, there may be, I think there might be one from the lower Fraser area, but I'm not familiar with those details.
Okay, and I want to be charitable here, and we're not here to blame anyone for anything, but can you explain to us why 5-6 years now after the implementation of the WSP, there has not been even one completed habitat status report within the Fraser watershed. Ms. Reid.
Yeah, so I can speak to that. So it took us a considerable amount of time and investment in order to develop the methodology for the work. And that was completed fairly recently with the publication of a science paper by Heather Stalberg and Ray Lozier, and I expect it's in Ringtail someplace, that document. Subsequent to that, the amount of funding that we had set aside to do the actual work went down quite considerably. So we only had a small amount of money left to do to start the habitat status indicator work, the nature of about $50,000 a year. Previous to that, we were spending over $300,000 a year. And so we picked a few watersheds where we thought we could work with partners most effectively, where we could lever resources. And we started, I think we did one in the Skeena, we did one in Barkley. The intention is to do them all, but it's a considerable amount of time and effort, and we simply haven't the resources to get them done
and
yet.
if you haven't had the resources to do that of recent day, you have no reason to be optimistic of having the resources over the next couple of years from what you've already spoken about with the shortage of money, correct?
Unless there's a reallocation towards this activity, that's correct.
Thank you. Now, Mr. LeBlanc, you yesterday spoke about the U.S. experience with Habitat, and you made reference to certain federal initiatives with Habitat. And if I understood you correctly, you gained some inspiration from the American experience, and if I understood you correctly, thought that we could learn something from that U.S. experience. Do I generally characterize your evidence satisfactorily?
Yes, you do.
Where would this commission gain more background, because I obviously don't have 5 hours to go back and forth with you to learn more about the American experience. Where would we learn more about that experience so that the commission would be educated about at least how they're handling things?
There's a National Fish Habitat Action Plan in the U.S. That you could, the website has a lot of information about that. There's also a bill before Congress called the National Fish Habitat Conservation Act, which is the bill to enable the whole plan to be implemented. It's been implemented, but it's been implemented on a small amount of money through a whole bunch of partners. However, they're trying to obtain some further funding from Congress and some collaboration among all the federal government departments, including the U.S. Geological Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the National Oceans Administration, the National Oceans and Atmospheric Administration, to come together to provide support for this National Fish Habitat Action Plan, which is really driven by a number of industry, and I mean industry here, the recreational fishing industry and other states and other interested parties that want to see conservation protection of fish habitat. So it is an intensive amount of work that's been done. Just recently, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the U.S. GS, Geological Service, has put a map of all of the U.S., and you can get down to sub watershed to show the pressures that are being placed by various kinds of development on the watershed. And that's the first tranche of defining some of the priority watersheds where they will be investing money. They spent $1 million just to collect the data. This is not research, this is collecting data and putting it on maps. And it took about a year just to do that.
You consult with your American colleagues from time to time?
Yes, we do. We had Dr. Beard from the U.S. Geological Service come to Ottawa just about 2 or 3 months ago to give us a presentation on the work that they've been doing on the U.S. National Fish Habitat Action Plan.
Do you have any summary documents of those meetings that you could make public and provide to this commission that would assist the commissioner?
Yes, I have the documents that I can make available.
I would make such request through your council for purposes of edifying this commission. Sorry.
I think the request has been made. I'm reluctant to invite any sort of a process that has these witnesses with questions and homework as opposed to answering questions today, it may be that we can follow up and try to assist and identify things that are on ringtail or otherwise. I take it that's not a request for follow-up answers so much as identifying documents.
Absolutely. It's not asking questions to you, Mr. LeBlanc. It's to provide this commission with more background information about the American
I'll
history.
just jump in for a moment, if I may. I've taken that request and the way it came up. It seemed a perfectly logical thing to dig out, and we will do that. But just as a flag on the play, if you like, this is not an examination for discovery, so I certainly don't want to see a creeping practice of many outstandings coming out of evidence. The witnesses, in the main, are here to give evidence and not collect a bunch of outstandings. If there are things, and this came up for the first time to Mr. Rosenblum's knowledge, but counsel thinking ahead, if they can ask us things before the witnesses get on the stand, then we'll, through the commission, accommodate that as best we can.
Obviously, on this American experience that came out only yesterday in testimony. I'll carry on. I have 2 or 3 other areas and I want to get through them. In respect to the interjurisdictional issues between BC and Canada, Mr. Wang, you said in testimony this morning, and I wrote these words down. In fact, sorry, you didn't say it. It's referred to in this Exhibit 662, which is the document that was written without imagining that it would ever end up before a Royal Commission. And so if we can go to 662, there is a reference there to, and if you go down to 5 paragraphs from the bottom, the relationship between province and DFO is in a state of dysfunction. We don't coordinate on referrals in any consistent way, and there is no guidance or leadership from Vancouver, Victoria on this, unquote. Okay, firstly, you still believe that to be the case?
In the general, yes, but I think things have improved somewhat since I wrote this.
Yes, and you wrote this again what year?
I believe it was July 2007.
Yes, and as I'm informed, and again, you're not speaking for the province, there's been a very diminished budget of the provincial side on environment and fisheries. Is that not correct? A reduction?
I can't really speak to the budget. I could say that we have seen less interaction. There are fewer people in different agencies for us to interact with. That may be a signal that there's been a budget change, but I'm not really familiar with their operational details.
And obviously that has a fallout in terms of the public interest of the sustainability of this resource.
Well, certainly it has affected our ability to work with certain provincial agencies in a way that's collaborative towards trying to get the best outcomes for fish.
Yes. Now, describing the relationship, albeit at the time you authored this document, as dysfunctional is very strong language. Now, my question is, we're here to try to resolve problems. What recommendation do you have to the Commission, if you can be brief about it, that might improve the interjurisdictional relationship to the point that it is more functional and in the public interest?
Well, it's a difficult response to give in a short and concise way. The issue in general goes to what I spoke to yesterday, which is Fisheries and Oceans has a mandate for fish habitat, whereas the province of British Columbia and local governments have authority over land use and water use. And the conundrum lies in coordinating those functions. And this has been presented in previous audits as an issue of challenge, and I would say it remains substantially today. And notwithstanding that, there have been examples where locally we've cooperated reasonably effectively, but they are generally reliant upon local individuals or relationships, and the issue more broadly still stands. And I don't know there's a simple answer, you know, in terms of me saying if the commissioner could wave a magic wand and just do this, it would be done, because the issue is very complex, and I think the fact that it hasn't been resolved, despite it being noted through numerous consecutive audits, is an indication that it's not an easy thing to come to terms with.
All right.
I'm just going to interrupt for this purpose, Mr. Commissioner, which is my timekeeper function. Mr. Harvey's asked to be added for 10 minutes of question. Ms. Brown had requested an hour. Ms. Robertson, 10 at a minimum, asking for further. You may have questions. I might have 3 or 4 minutes of questions in re-examination on a few points. And for us to do all of that before 4, I think we'll all need to speed up, if you will. I'm alerting Mr. Rosenblum to that.
I'm still trying to comply with my allotted time. I have 5 minutes left. I started at 10 minutes to 12. I went to 12:30. I initially said 50 minutes to you, Council. I then asked, you agreed to give me another 20 minutes because the will says are not going
I'm
in.
not going to spend 5 minutes fighting about the 5 minutes. We'll have the further 5 and then we'll move on. Thank you.
Thank you. Panel, what makes... I've heard testimony that there is you're putting together a new habitat policy, if I've heard that correctly. Is that right? That's the direction?
We're reviewing the current policy. We've been reviewing for quite a while, and we have a proposal to put in place a process that would allow us to renew the policy and the program.
Yes. And my question is, in light of the financial restrictions as we've heard about them today, what makes one believe that a new habitat policy is likely to bring any better results in habitat management than what we're dealing with today?
Through our dialogue and our consultations with various sectors of society, we'll find out whether that is the case. So when we launch this, we have no intent. At the end of the day, we may modify the policy. We'll decide after we have a dialogue with Canadians. There's a process that's been laid in place. I think I mentioned to you that it would take approximately 6 months of dialogue with Canadians. And then we decide whether and to what extent we would modify the policy. It may just be including some of the newer things that we have now. We don't have any mention of the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, Species at Risk Act. Some of the documentation is inaccurate. For example, the arrangements we have with inland provinces is not the same as it was in 1986. In 1999, we expanded the program into the inland provinces. So there's a lot of things that have changed as that policy. Just look at the pictures of the policy. You might want to reflect on that. We might want to modernize the pictures.
But would you not agree that the financial side, an increase in budget is absolutely critical to any confidence that there will be an improved habitat management scheme in Canada?
I think we could all agree that any program in the department or in the federal government could use more money. It would make it much better.
Thank you. My last area of cross-examination, I have maybe 2 minutes left, 3 minutes left, is I have requested from the Commission, and from the Commission they requested DFO information about bonuses and salaries to directors and regionally, and to regional directors, and to Director Generals in Ottawa. I have not yet received reply. It's been 2 months that my request has been made to the Commission, and indeed the Commission to your Council. My question to you, Ms. Reid, is you are a regional director. Do you receive a bonus for performance in respect to your area of work?
I object. This is a request that has been made, has been said, and it is being dealt with. I don't see why we have to or should advance the answering of that on an ad hoc basis with one witness. There will be an answer given. I've told the Commission that. The Commission has told the Participants' Council, and it remains outstanding.
Mr. Commissioner, I don't want to belabor this, but I've waited 2 months for this information. This panel is before us. Why would it take 2 months for the Government of Canada to respond to a question that is pretty simple? I'm prejudiced if I cannot ask this witness the simple question, which is, one, are there bonuses as incorporated within your salary structure? And as Director of Habitat for the region, have you received a bonus over the last few years for your work? That is my question. And how can I get that evidence if indeed 2 months there's been an outstanding request for this information from the government?
Quite apart from the outstanding request, Mr. Rosenblum, I think if the witness is in a position to answer the question that you have asked, I will ask her to do so if you're directing it to Ms. Reid. If she's not, she will say so, and her counsel will have to address whatever she says about why she can't answer the question and act accordingly. So I'm going to allow you to ask the question. It's a matter of whether she's in a position today to answer it for you, and if not, she can explain why.
Yeah. Mr. Commissioner, forgive me, but why would anyone not remember whether they received a bonus?
We're going to find out.
Thank you. Ms. Reid?
Yeah, I can answer the question.
Thank you.
So as an executive, part of my pay is based on performance. There's a performance element to it. So every year I write a performance management agreement, and based on the specific results of that agreement, I receive a bonus or I don't. So yes, I have received a bonus for the work that I've done.
And that has been each year since you've taken over that regional directorship?
That's right, yes.
Thank you. No further questions.
Mr. Commissioner, next on the list, Mr. Harvey, 10 minutes.
Yes. So I have a question for the panel generally. Now, and it has a bit of a preamble to it. Basically, you've given us a lot of important details about habitat loss, but I, for one, am struggling to put it into perspective in terms of the contribution it has, if any, to the contribution that habitat loss has to the decline of the Fraser River sockeye. So that's where I'm coming from. And I first want to ask if I'm correct that habitat loss is relevant and perhaps critical if it reduces the carrying capacity of either the spawning grounds or the rearing lakes. Is that a correct starting point?
So your question is the second part of what you just laid out?
Yes.
Well, certainly that's a useful general summary. I would say biologically it's a bit more detailed than that, but I don't think we want to get into a biology lesson at this juncture, so we can leave it at that.
All right. No, we have had, and the rearing lakes has been described in previous evidence, have a certain carrying capacity depending on the size of the lakes and the food supply in the lakes. And we've had a lot of evidence on the importance of maintaining the delicate balance between the number of fry in the rearing lakes, resulting from the number of spawners, and the nutrient capacity in those rearing lakes. For example, there was a discussion in February from a panel, very interesting discussion, about the effects of the very large escapement levels that we've had in the last decade or so. And that panel on February 9th and 10th expressed the opinion that the carrying capacity of the large lakes, Chilko, Shuswap, and Quesnel, had been exceeded, such that the number of fry that resulted were reduced in growth and in the survival rates. I'll just read you a very short passage. This is from Dr. Woody on February 10th at page 22. And he was discussing as I say, these very large escapements at the level above optimal escapements.
Is this something we have before us to look at, or are you just reading it?
Well, if it's a problem, I can have it put up. It's February 10th, page 22, line 16 or 17 is about where I'm coming in. He says they've shown decreased productivity, principally because of juvenile survival and growth in the lakes. that are causing the survival rates in the ocean to go down in those years. And that's just a small snippet of a large, extensive discussion on that subject. And that leads me to my question. The question is that discussion, that important discussion, appeared to proceed on the assumption that the carrying capacity of our rearing lakes has been constant over the past 50 years or so. But it strikes me, having heard your evidence, that they may have overlooked something very important. And that is that habitat changes have reduced the carrying capacity of our rearing lakes. So that is my question. Are you inviting the Commission to take from your evidence a conclusion that the carrying capacity of our rearing lakes have been reduced by habitat changes?
I think it was earlier today I spoke to the difficulty in knowing for sure how much the change in habitat in the lakes and streams and the freshwater environment for sockeye affects the carrying capacity or the population response. What we have observed over time is a cumulative change. So it's been an incremental change, and it's been cumulative. So every year's change is stacked on top of the change from all previous years. And very few of those changes are things that we would characterize as positive for sockeye or the fish habitat in general. So I think what we could say is, compared to background natural conditions, human activity has resulted in changes that are almost certainly not favorable for sockeye or freshwater fish, but the degree to which that affects the overall carrying capacity and productivity, I don't think we're in a position to really conclude on that at this point.
But if it's done anything, it would have reduced the carrying capacity. It wouldn't have increased the carrying capacity. Is that correct?
It's most likely that it would have reduced the carrying capacity, in my opinion.
Have you seen in any way that this opinion has been taken into account by the fishery managers in charge of determining how much escapement there is capable of being carried in the rearing lakes?
Not particularly. I think you'd have to ask the fishery managers that more specifically, but we are generally not providing information on background carrying capacity to support fishery management decisions. That's not something that has been part of our normal programming.
I see. All right, thank you. Those are my questions.
Mr. Commissioner, next I have Ms. Brown for the First Nations Coalition. I wonder if I might canvass the point I made earlier. I think in light of the ground we have yet to cover, we'll be pushing to complete by 4, and I wonder if it may be possible either to do a short or no break through the afternoon session.
No, I don't know, Commission Council. I heard you say this morning we were very comfortable in handing out more time to folks, so I'm going to take a 10-minute break because I think that's needed for staff and at least for me, and we'll just have to have council divide up what time is available amongst them fairly as best they can. Thank you.
Thank you. And do you wish we can move to that break now? Does that, or to continue on? Thank you, and I'll make that point at 3:15. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Anya Brown, appearing for the First Nations Coalition, and with me is Leah Pence. And for the benefit of the panelists, the First Nations Coalition, as well as the Council of the Haida Nation, and we also represent a number of Aboriginal organizations with interests in respect of the Fraser River. I'm going to start out by asking some questions about the 1986 Habitat Policy, which recognizes in part that First Nations could assume a greater role in local fisheries management and environmental protection in the future. And my question is, and I suppose I'll start by directing it to Ms. Reid, can you say whether in the past 25 years that the policy has been in place, whether this has happened?
Well, I can say that over the past 25 years, how the department has worked with First Nations has changed significantly. There's been a number of programs put into place, the Aboriginal Fisheries Strategy, the ARAM program, PICFI, some others, all of which are intended to support First Nations involvement in fisheries management and habitat management type activities. So under the Aboriginal Fisheries Strategy, for example, there's funding provided which allows for First Nations involvement in habitat type projects. There's capacity under the ARAM program which allows First Nations to build technical capability in order to become meaningfully involved in processes. There's certainly a recognition and understanding of the importance of Canada's fiduciary responsibility towards First Nations and our need to, consult in a meaningful way in cases where First Nations access could be impacted by projects, those sorts of things. So there's a number of ways through planning processes, through strategies and initiatives that over the past 25 years, I'd say that First Nations have become a lot more involved in management and habitat type activities.
Now, Mr. LeBlanc, you spoke yesterday about the process that will take place to update or modernize the habitat policy. And are you able to give us any indication of how you anticipate changes to the policy that incorporate what's now known as the duty to consult?
Yes, I think one of the changes that could be made to the policy would be a recognition of the rights of Aboriginal people across Canada, and to be more explicit on the duty to consult Aboriginal peoples.
And we've heard you give evidence today and yesterday about how much of the department's focus is in respect of the referral process. And I'm wondering if you can give us a sense of what the current mechanism is in place in terms of DFO's consultation with affected First Nations.
As part of the regulatory review process, prior to making any regulatory decisions, that is issuance of authorizations under Section 35 and 35(2) and 32, we have a duty to consult Aboriginal people in terms of the impacts that may have on their rights. And the other part of it is that in prior to making those regulatory decisions, we have another process, the Canadian the application of an environmental assessment process, ensuring that that process is followed. And as part of that, there is a requirement to consult with Aboriginal people on the impact that the project may have on their traditional use of land and resources. We've developed training programs, we've developed guidelines, guidance for staff to make sure that they undertake those requirements to consult with Aboriginal during the EA process, the environmental assessment process, and as part of the regulatory decision making.
All right, and you gave some evidence yesterday about the review process that will take place in respect of the habitat policy, and you told us that it's currently undergoing an internal review, and you spoke about an external process that will take place, which will include engagement and consultation with partners and stakeholders. And will that include First Nations as well?
Yes, it will include all Aboriginal people. The major organizations will be working through national and regional organizations to get input from Aboriginal peoples across Canada.
All right, and has a time frame for that been established yet?
No, because it was before the minister, and no approval has been made to launch an engagement strategy or plan that we had put in place, which was, as I mentioned before, a dialogue with Canadians, with all Canadians, including Aboriginal peoples, and a consultation following any decision to modify the policy.
Now, one of the things that you said yesterday about this new policy and what you expected we might see in there was that it would apply, if I understood your evidence correctly, that it would apply a more ecosystem-based approach, which would include identifying what you called priority habitats. Have I got that right?
That could be part of the policy, yes.
All right. And what I'm wondering is whether the definition or the department's definition of priority habitats would include habitats identified by First Nations as being of particular importance to them.
If I was looking at trying to identify priorities for habitat priority areas, I would make sure that, or we would as a department, and I would support this, is that we would consult with local communities to ensure that we have all the available information available from everyone to identify those priority areas.
The council has become a conduit for questions from communities on hydroelectric mitigation and the process the Crown proposes to fulfill their obligation to consult and accommodate First Nations title and rights. Then I'll skip down to the last sentence of that page. We're particularly interested in how the Crown plans to fulfill its obligation to First Nations and how DFO plans to engage First Nations in all decisions and processes which infringe or have the potential to infringe on asserted, claimed, and proven title and rights. So I'm not asking you to comment on this specific project. What I'm asking for is whether you're able to advise of what mechanism or process would be in place or would the department engage in to respond to questions such as this. Perhaps Mr. Wang would be able to answer that. So what I'm looking for is really an on-the-ground sense of what happens to inquiries such as this, where First Nations become aware of a particular project that may have implications on habitat in their territory.
Hydro is a difficult example for that question, because what you're dealing with most of the time with a hydro operation is something that's already there. And the regulatory trigger that Fisheries and Oceans has under our statutory authority comes when we go to issue an authorization for something. So the hydro example in the context of, say, BC Hydro, which is what most people sort of first thought is in that regard, is it's a very complex environment where we're dealing in some regard to try to reconcile not only the historic effects of the hydro facilities, but also the ongoing operational effects. They're largely, the processes to deal with these things are largely being led by either BC Hydro itself or through the provincial government under the water controller, who permits the water allocation and use. DFO is aligned with those processes, and for example, for the operational effects, over the last I think 10 or 12 years or so, there's been a process called water use planning. And the water use planning was, in essence, trying to look at all the operational considerations and trade-offs that went along with having these hydro facilities in place, looking at not only fisheries issues, but also other environmental issues, other socioeconomic issues, as well as very significantly First Nation issues within the areas of operation for these facilities. And I would say that DFO participated actively in those processes. We were certainly not the lead, but there was a mechanism and opportunity for First Nation interests to be tabled through that process. So that would be the example, I suppose, tying to the hydro question.
All right. And in a more general sense, what I'm trying to understand is at what point is the duty to consult triggered? Is it at some point after a referral application is received, or when does it typically happen?
Well, I can speak operationally. I'm certainly not a constitutional expert or anything like that.
Absolutely not. I'm just simply asking for what happens on the ground as you know it.
Our trigger comes when we are in a situation where we have a statutory decision to exercise. So when we get a project, we have a look at it. If it's a project that falls within our authority to say, yes, this may require an authorization, and it looks like it's heading that way, because some projects that come in that may require an authorization end up not proceeding or taking a different path. But if it looks like it's going to head down that road, then that indication when we come to that realization is our signal or trigger to initiate a consultative process.
All right. I'd like to enter that document as an exhibit, please.
Exhibit number 666.
Thank you. When the time does come for consultation, Mr. Wang, does that typically take place with an individual First Nation, or would it happen at a more regional level?
Well, I would say from our experience in the interior area, there is no typical. It's quite dependent upon the interest of the First Nations in the area where the work is occurring. There are times when it's relatively well defined and singular. There are other times when there's a bit of a plurality where there are overlapping traditional areas or areas of claim, and we will consult quite broadly with different layers or entities within the First Nations communities.
And would the type of consultation that you engage in also depend on the nature of the referral itself and how specific or broad, small or large it might be?
Yes, that's accurate.
Now, we've heard that the referral process examines impacts to fish and fish habitat. And would you agree that as part of the referral process, that one of the things that the department also must consider is how those impacts to fish and fish habitat, assuming that in the course of your work you determine that there are potential impacts, is part of the consideration the way that those impacts will in turn affect First Nations' right to fish?
Certainly. Operationally, we generally refer to it as the need to consider right title and traditional use. So traditional use can include not only fishing, but even things like collecting medicinal plants or plants for food and things like that. And there's certainly no limit to the kinds of issues a First Nation may wish to bring to the department for consideration as a potential impact or concern associated with our consideration with regard to rendering our decision on a project.
How does, and this is a question that I'd really direct to any one of the three of you, how does the no net loss principle and the exchange of units, the compensation principle, I suppose, of habitat, take into account Aboriginal priority fishing, which takes place on a site-specific basis or in a site-specific way?
Lead with that, and maybe Patrice or Rebecca can add if they like. But when we look at these things at the operational level, we look at them first very specifically on what is the potential impact to the fisheries resource from that activity. And in considering that, if we are contemplating permitting it, we look at the compensation side, which is the offset piece to achieve the no net loss, in a way that most generally falls within the hierarchy of preferences that we have established in the policy. So the first thing we try to do is get a similar habitat function in a similar location, or as we work down the hierarchy, other things that will have benefits to the stocks that are affected. So while I wouldn't say that we go specifically to considering how would a particular First Nation fishery potentially be affected, what I think that consideration is captured in the way we approach it more from the ecological basis, which is we're trying to reflect a neutral or even positive outcome for the fish and the fish stocks that are going to be potentially affected by that project.
I think we've seen in some of the Quigley and Harper reports that there's certainly some debate or critique about the exchange of one area of habitat for another and whether that's something that's ecologically sustainable. Do you agree that there's ongoing debate about the appropriateness of that?
Certainly, compensating for an impacted habitat is difficult. It is hard for humans to go out and replicate something created by nature that all the creatures and everything out there has adapted to. So I think it's possible, and there are examples where habitat compensation has been successful, but there's plenty where it hasn't been, and there's still a lot to learn, and it's not something that we take lightly in terms of considering whether to issue an authorization. And the first thing that we always try to do is to avoid that impact by having the proponent redesign their project. So it's only when there are no other feasible options that the department contemplates allowing the harmful impact. And by way of our authorizations, we try to build in factors that are, I call them in favor of fish, where we will ask for perhaps 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 in terms of a footprint of compensation area over and above the impacted area, recognizing that some of this stuff doesn't work as well as humans will think about it when they design their planning.
Right, and looking at it from the perspective of Aboriginal people fishing, would you agree that in exchange of one salmon-bearing stream for another may not be an appropriate outcome if that substituted stream is perhaps in a neighboring First Nations territory, or perhaps simply a stream that's not a preferred fishing site, let's put it that way?
Well, I would agree with your example, but we don't really do that. I won't say never, but for the most part, any compensation that DFO asks for has a direct benefit to the stock that is potentially being impacted. It's not always right beside the impacted area, but it is something that our staff put our minds to, because we're trying essentially to maintain the ecological values and integrity within that watershed. So if we were allowing impacts in the Fraser and doing compensation in the Skeena, that what you lay out would be a valid consideration, but generally the department doesn't do that.
But would a First Nations concern be considered by DFO? And I'm not talking about a situation as far removed as the Skeena, but if we were talking about streams fairly close to each other within the Fraser, if there was a concern from a First Nation about the substituted piece, is that something that would be considered?
Certainly.
Mr. Hwang, again, in your experience, have there been opportunities for First Nations to work with your department on habitat compensation plans or proposing mitigation measures, working cooperatively in some sense?
Yes, there's been many, and they're ongoing.
And do those at any time incorporate First Nations traditional knowledge?
As much as they care to bring them forward, yes.
Are there also any examples that you're aware of, or where, and this, I welcome or invite Ms. Reid to speak to this as well. Do either of you know of any specific instances where First Nations are actively involved in monitoring habitat in conjunction with the department?
Well, I could say I'm aware of very narrowly specific circumstances where there has been some monitoring, perhaps involving First Nations related to a particular compensation project, say, or something like that. But more generally, on, say, a strategic basis or something, not that I'm aware of.
I think one example that you could draw on is the BC Hydro example, in that BC Hydro has what they call compensation projects. It's not, we don't use the term in quite the same way, but their compensation projects do certainly involve the local First Nations, and there is quite a bit of work with those groups.
Mr. Hwang, at the end of the day yesterday, you spoke of how the referral process might change in the face of an emergency situation. And I'm wondering if you're able to tell us at all how the duty to consult or the engagement process that your department enters into with First Nations would change if the department was responding to an emergency situation.
The nature and the urgency of the emergency has some bearing on how much that may change. But at the end of the day, the guidance that we have as we interpret it operationally is do as much as you can and incorporate as many of the considerations or concerns as you can. But it's also to keep in mind that if the issue at hand is a legitimate high-risk situation, that we may not have the ability to take the time and prior to issuing our authorization, address all of the concerns that may come forward as we would normally when you don't have that kind of time constraint. So we do our best, and it's certainly a high priority. We've had many projects that we've pushed quite far beyond the project owner's ideal starting time to provide for more time to consult and engage with First Nations, and we have pushed many proponents quite hard to adjust their plans to incorporate concerns that First Nations have brought forward.
Now, you spoke a little bit earlier this afternoon about the complexity of sorting out the interjurisdictional relationship between the province of British Columbia and the department in terms of habitat management. Would you agree that First Nations jurisdiction and sorting that out and addressing First Nations concerns adds a further layer of complexity for the department in the work that it does?
Most certainly does on the habitat front.
Now, Mr. Huang, again, we heard yesterday, and we've heard today as well, that the referral process is a voluntary one, and really that the only way for a project, large or small, to come to DFO's attention is if the proponent self-refers. And you noted yesterday the cumulative impact of those projects where a proponent chooses to not bring You noted yesterday the cumulative impact of those projects that the proponent chooses to not bring to DFO's attention. I'm wondering whether the department has any sense of the percentage of projects that take place that may cause degradation to the habitat that don't engage in the voluntary referral process.
Well, I'll put a bit of a qualifier on that the cumulative impacts are not necessarily just from things that project proponents don't bring to us. Sometimes
right.
They come from things that we do review. We don't really have a good sense of what proportion are coming from things we don't see. We have undertaken through our relatively new monitoring program a little bit of work trying to have a look at that, where we did an audit of what were mentioned yesterday of things called operational statements, which set out a pre-existing set of recommendations for certain activities that were classified as low risk, that if the proponent were to undertake them that way, the department is pretty sure they would not cause harm to habitat. So what our staff tried to do is have a look at a sample of those kinds of activities and say, how many of these did we get notification on, and let's find some that we didn't, and let's see how they compare to each other. And I don't have a really clear recollection of the details, but I can say that we didn't see anything alarming, because I know that would have registered with me. So the signal back is that it doesn't necessarily, at least with that very small snapshot, it doesn't stand out that it's easy to put your finger on that as a major culprit or not. But I have to emphasize that was a really small window into a much bigger piece of work.
All right. Mr. Bissett, could you please turn up number 9 from the Commission's list, please? And Mr. LeBlanc, you'll recognize this as one of the Quigley and Harper studies. This is from 2005, and it's one where I noted in the acknowledgements that you were one of the people that did the technical review of that. And I think you noted yesterday that one of the conclusions made was that the study, as have other Quigley and Harper studies, they've revealed that there's a weakness in NNL compliance, and we've heard about that. And I'll just note that the study at page 353, and I'll just refer to it, I won't take you to it, but what the authors there said, that one of the most alarming findings of the study was that out of the 124 authorizations that they examined, they were able to make determinations about no net loss in only 17 of those, and they identified as, I think we've heard that one of the primary reasons was because of poor proponent compliance. Now, I noted with interest that out of those 124 authorizations that were looked at, actually 105 came from BC. So according to my calculations, 85%. And out of those 105, 83 actually came from the Fraser River Basin. Now I'm just going to quickly take you to the conclusions of the study at page 354. And I'll just quickly paraphrase them. It's in the last part of the text immediately above the acknowledgements. So the findings there indicate, and most of this we've heard, DFO should improve record keeping, have better management, address poor proponent compliance through increased compliance and enforcement, and incorporate a standardized science-based approach into monitoring to assess the effectiveness of fish habitat compensation projects in achieving NNL. And my question simply is whether any specific steps have been taken by the department to address poor proponent compliance in the time period since this report was written.
One of the effort was the out of the environmental process modernization plan, increasing capacity and focus on compliance monitoring, or monitoring the conformity with the requirements of authorization. So that has started. We've staffed people across Canada in the Habitat program to focus their attention on monitoring and auditing compliance. The other one is that we are working with our science colleagues to develop a standard scientifically sound methodology for what we call follow-up monitoring. That is to evaluate or to verify the accuracy of the predicted impact or harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of habitat, and to verify the accuracy or the effectiveness of the compensation measures. So both of those are underway. One, the compliance has been in place now since, I believe, 2006 or 7, when we started to roll out that compliance regime, new compliance monitoring regime. And if I recall, we've been talking with our science colleague and just had several workshops to engage them in developing that standardized methodology that we could apply across Canada.
All right, thank you. And if I could enter that document as an exhibit, please.
Exhibit number 667.
Mr. Commissioner, I note the time, and I'm wondering if this might be a convenient time for the afternoon break.
It would be, Ms. Brown. I think when we come back, it'll be 3:30, so whoever's left has to divide up that time available. Thank you very much.
Yes, I'll speak with my friends that haven't yet made their submissions.
Hearing will now recess for 10 minutes.